Karen Whitfield cherished her neighborhood deeply, considering it her personal sanctuary, her meticulously curated slice of perfection where every detail was in its rightful place. Karen, a woman in her mid-40s with fair skin, blonde hair styled to precision, and flawless makeup, thrived on structure and predictability. Her days followed a strict routine: morning jogs along tree-lined streets, leisurely breakfasts at her favorite cafe, and afternoons dedicated to organizing community events. To Karen, maintaining the neighborhood standards was not just a preference but a responsibility she carried with pride. However, her orderly world was soon disrupted, throwing her carefully crafted life into disarray. A new neighbor moved in next door, and from the moment Karen saw him, something felt off. He was a black man in his early 50s, dressed casually in jeans and a plain shirt, his relaxed demeanor starkly contrasting with the polished professionals Karen was used to seeing in her neighborhood. He greeted the movers warmly, even helping carry boxes inside, his friendly smile a sharp deviation from the stoic faces Karen typically associated with neighbors. Watching him through her window, Karen's own smile faded. He didn't fit her mental picture of the ideal neighbor, and that discrepancy unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Over the following days, Karen's unease grew. This man, whose name she didn't know, frequently had visitors, teenagers, adults, and elderly individuals alike, coming and going at all hours. They gathered on his porch, laughing, chatting, and sharing lively conversations as though they had known one another for years. The vibrant gatherings were unlike anything Karen had seen in her neighborhood, where quiet dinners and polite nods were the norm. Unable to comprehend what could attract such a varied group of people to his home, Karen's discomfort deepened into suspicion. It wasn't typical for her neighborhood, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One Sunday afternoon, determined to learn more, Karen decided to investigate. She poured herself a cup of coffee, grabbed her phone, and took a leisurely stroll past his house, pretending to be engrossed in her screen. As she approached, snippets of cheerful conversations reached her ears. The man was seated on the porch, surrounded by a group of young people, his laughter ringing out as he shared jokes and stories. His warmth and ease with his guests were evident, yet to Karen, it seemed staged, as though he was putting on a show to hide something more sinister. She returned home, her suspicion morphing into paranoia, her thoughts spiraling until she convinced herself that action was necessary. Later that evening, unable to contain her anxiety, Karen picked up the phone and dialed the police. Her hands trembled as she spoke, trying to steady her voice. "Hello, I'd like to report a suspicious individual in my neighborhood," she said, the words tasting bitter as they left her mouth. "He doesn't seem to belong here, and I feel unsafe." Within minutes, a patrol car arrived, its flashing lights cutting through the peaceful evening, casting red and blue shadows across the street. Karen watched from her window, her chest tight with a strange mix of satisfaction and apprehension. The officers approached her neighbor's house, their expression serious. He was still on the porch, engrossed in conversation, his laughter fading as he noticed the officers. The young people around him exchanged nervous glances, and the air grew tense. Calm but visibly confused, the man stood and greeted the officers politely. They asked for his identification, and Karen held her breath as he reached into his pocket, handing over his ID without hesitation. His voice was steady and composed as he introduced himself and explained who his guests were. The officers, after examining the ID, exchanged a brief, whispered conversation before their demeanor shifted noticeably. They returned his ID with a respectful nod, their posture softening as they offered a few quiet words Karen couldn't hear. Her neighbor smiled graciously, resumed his conversation with his guests, and appeared entirely unfazed by the incident. Karen, however, stood frozen at her window, stunned. The officers had left without any further questioning, their abrupt departure leaving her in a state of confusion. The satisfaction she initially felt dissolved, replaced by a nagging sense of unease. What had she missed? Why had the officers reacted the way they did? The next morning, Karen overheard whispers at the cafe, her neighbors discussing the incident in hushed tones. "Did you hear?" one woman said, her voice tinged with awe. "He's not just anyone, he's the director of the FBI." The words hit Karen like a thunderclap. Her stomach churned as she realized the gravity of her mistake. Her new neighbor wasn't an outsider or a threat, he was a high-ranking official investigating corruption and discrimination within law enforcement. He was undercover, observing the local police department's practices. Karen felt a wave of nausea as shame washed over her. Her impulsive call to the police hadn't revealed anything about him, it had exposed her own prejudice. That evening, a knock on her door startled her. Opening it hesitantly, she found her neighbor standing there, calm and composed. "Hi, Karen," he began, his tone gentle yet firm. "I wanted to talk about what happened yesterday. I know you called the police. I understand why you might have felt uneasy, but we need to address the impact of actions like that." His words were measured, devoid of anger, yet the disappointment in his eyes was unmistakable. Karen felt exposed, her defenses crumbling under the weight of his gaze. "Quick judgments can lead to unnecessary conflict," he continued, his voice steady. "We all want a safe community, but safety begins with understanding, not suspicion." Karen nodded, unable to meet his eyes, her throat tight with regret. The next day, she woke with a new resolve. Her old routines, once a source of comfort, now felt hollow. Determined to make amends, she attended the upcoming community meeting with an idea in mind. Instead of her usual critiques, she proposed organizing a community picnic to bring neighbors together. "It's time we get to know each other better," she said, surprising even herself. The idea was met with enthusiasm, and Karen threw herself into the planning, arranging activities, games, and food that encouraged connection and interaction. On the day of the picnic, the park buzzed with laughter and lively chatter. Karen caught sight of her neighbor watching from a distance, a slight smile playing on his lips. He approached her as the event wound down, extending a hand. "You've done a great job, Karen," he said warmly. "This is a good start." Karen shook his hand, a genuine smile breaking across her face. "Thank you," she replied, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "I realize now how wrong I was. I'm grateful we could move forward." That evening, the two shared a meal, talking not just about the neighborhood but about life, values, and the importance of empathy. For the first time in years, Karen felt a true connection with someone entirely different from herself. It was a small yet significant step toward seeing the world through a broader, more compassionate lens. As the night drew to a close, Karen returned home with a newfound sense of peace. Her neighborhood, once a rigid reflection of her ideals, now felt brighter, livelier, a place of growth and possibility. The change she had feared became the change she needed, and in that transformation, she found a deeper understanding of herself and others.